January 16, 1943, Portland Harbor, Oregon. The morning was calm and cold, the water a perfect mirror beneath a pale gray sky. Dock workers moved slowly through the fog, their breath turning to mist, as they prepared another Liberty ship for inspection. The SS Schenectady had been launched only weeks earlier, fresh from the Kaiser shipyards, a gleaming symbol of American industrial might. She was the product of a miracle ships built faster than ever before, welded, instead of riveted, assembled like cars rolling off an assembly line. But as the sun rose over the harbor, that miracle was about to turn into a nightmare. At 11:15 a.m., a sharp metallic crack echoed across the docks. It sounded like a gunshot, then another, then a chorus of tearing steel. Within seconds, the SS Schenectady's massive hull began to bend. Witnesses later said it looked like the ship was breathing. The deck plates rippled as if alive, then split open with a deafening roar. A fracture raced from bow to stern in a single terrifying moment, slicing through the ship like an invisible knife. Men shouted and scrambled for safety as the vessel tore itself apart at the dock. When the noise stopped, the Schenectady was no longer a ship. She was two halves of twisted steel, her keel broke in her deck, hanging like torn paper over the black water. There had been no storm, no explosion, no torpedo. The ship had simply cracked in half while tied to the pier. It made no sense. Investigators gathered within hours. Engineers crawled across the wreck, their boots clanging on cold metal. The fractures were smooth, almost surgical, as if the steel had shattered rather than torn. Theories poured in: bad welds, cheap steel, design flaws, sabotage. But none of them explained why the ship had failed so violently and why it wasn't the first. Because the Schenectady was only the latest casualty in a growing list. In the previous months, Liberty ships around the world had begun splitting apart without warning. The SS John P. Gaines had snapped in half in calm seas off Alaska, her crew thrown into the freezing Pacific. The T-2 tanker SS Manhattan had fractured so suddenly, her sailors abandoned ship in panic, convinced they had been torpedoed. Between 1943 and 1944, more than 2,500 ships reported serious structural failures, cracks in their hulls decks, splitting open steel plates, shearing like glass. 19 ships broke completely in two. 3 simply vanished at sea, leaving only oil slicks and debris. These were not enemy kills, they were self-destruction ships committing suicide. And every one of them had been built the same way, welded fast and mass-produced. To understand the scale of the problem, one had to understand what the Liberty ship represented. After Pearl Harbor, the United States faced an impossible logistics crisis. It needed cargo ships, hundreds of them, to carry weapons, food, and fuel across 2 oceans. Traditional shipbuilding took 8 months for a single vessel. That was too slow for total war. So industrialist Henry Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship before, promised something revolutionary. Mass-produced cargo ships built like cars, assembled in weeks instead of months. Kaiser's idea worked, at least at first. By late 1942, his shipyards were launching Liberty ships every 42 days. Propaganda films celebrated the miracle of American industry. Women welders replaced male riveters who had gone to war sparks, flying beneath banners that read, "Speed wins wars." And for a moment it seemed true. But speed had a cost that no one understood yet. In the frozen waters of the North Atlantic, where temperatures plunged below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Liberty ships began to fail in strange ways. The welded hulls that saved so much time in production were behaving differently than the old riveted ones. Small cracks that should have stopped at a seam were instead racing unchecked across entire hulls, devouring steel in seconds. The very process that made the ships fast to build was making them fatally brittle. Sailors began to fear the vessels meant to save them. Some refused to sleep below deck, terrified of being trapped if the hull gave way in the night. Others spoke of hearing eerie pings echoing through the steel like the sound of glass under strain, just hours before disaster struck. Engineers called it superstition. but the superstitions were multiplying because the cracks were real. By the end of 1943, the Liberty ship program, once America's greatest industrial triumph, was turning into a national embarrassment. Each fracture wasn't just a ship lost. It was a logistical artery, severed a blow to the war effort, measured in thousands of tons of cargo and hundreds of lives. Yet no one could explain it. The press called it the mystery of the breaking ships. In Washington, congressional committees demanded answers. Naval architects blamed the welders. The welders blamed the steel mills. The steel mills blamed the designers. And while they argued, more ships broke apart in the night. The miracle that had carried America's hopes across the sea was cracking under its own success. And in a shipyard in California, under flickering lamps and clouds of welding smoke, a woman no one had ever heard of was about to see what all the experts had missed. Henry Kaiser had promised that he could do the impossible. In 1941, when the U.S. Maritime Commission approached him about building cargo ships, most of Washington's shipbuilding establishment laughed. Kaiser was a dam builder, not a naval architect. He had poured concrete at Hoover Dam, not riveted steel in a dry dock. But Kaiser didn't believe in doing things the traditional way. "We'll build them like cars," he told reporters, "factories on the water." And when America's entry into war turned the ocean into a battlefield, he delivered on that promise with breathtaking speed. At his shipyards in Richmond, California and Portland, Oregon, construction looked nothing like the shipbuilding of the past. Gone were the slow rhythms of riveters hammering red-hot bolts into cooling plates. Instead, giant prefabrication sheds produced entire sections of hulls ready to be welded together. Sparks rained from scaffolds day and night. Conveyor belts carried supplies from steel mills directly into assembly lines. Floodlights turned midnight into noon. The pace was biblical. Ships that had once taken 8 months to build were now rolling off the line in 40 days or less. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was completed from keel to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. Newspapers called it the ship that beat the clock. The world called it a miracle. But in every miracle, there's a flaw hidden beneath the glory. The Liberty ship was an engineering compromise designed for speed, not longevity. It wasn't built to last 20 years. It only had to survive the war. Riveting the traditional method required precision and time. Welding was faster. It also saved weight and allowed simpler construction. But welding introduced new kinds of stress no one fully understood. Unlike riveted joints, which acted as natural crack stoppers, welded seams created continuous sheets of metal from bow to stern. That continuity was strong under compression, but terrifyingly fragile under tension. In California's mild climate, the problem was invisible. The ships launched in Richmond sailed smoothly out of the bay, their welded hulls gleaming under the sun. But in the cold Atlantic, things were different. At temperatures near freezing, the steel lost its ductility, its ability to bend instead of break. A small imperfection, a sharp corner, even the faintest microscopic flaw could become the starting point of catastrophe. And the way Kaiser's shipyards were building these vessels made the flaws inevitable. Welding replaced the old teams of riveters with small crews of electric welders, many of them women new to industrial work. They were fast, precise, and proud. Propaganda posters called them Rosie the Riveter, though in truth they were welders now. These women worked 16-hour shifts under clouds of smoke and heat, their masks glowing blue. Every shipyard bulletin board carried the same slogan, "Speed is the best armor." It was the gospel of the war economy. Speed meant victory. Speed meant freedom. Speed also meant mistakes. Each Liberty ship was assembled from hundreds of welded sections, but no one had established a standard welding sequence. Crews often welded long seams from one end to the other in a single pass. When the metal cooled, it contracted unevenly. The surrounding plate, still hot, resisted the pull-locking residual stress deep into the structure. Every finished weld trapped a little more strain. By the time a ship was completed, its hull carried millions of invisible pounds of tension coiled like a spring, waiting for the right conditions to snap. Yet no one saw it that way in 1942. To the public, Kaiser's shipyards were monuments to progress. Newsreels showed smiling women in coveralls, sparks flying as swing music played in the background. The message was clear: America had turned its industrial might into a weapon. Henry Kaiser himself became a national hero, the man who had solved the logistics crisis. When President Roosevelt visited the Richmond Yard, he called it proof that democracy can outproduce tyranny. And then the cracks began. At first, they were minor, thin hairlines near deck hatches or cargo openings. The engineers dismissed them as surface imperfections, but the cracks kept growing. Some ships reported sudden pops during voyages, the sound of steel plates releasing tension. Others developed leaks around the seams, where welded joints met sharp corners. In late 1942, entire hull sections began splitting apart. The failures came without warning, without enemy fire, without storms. Crews described it as if the ship itself was alive and tearing apart from within. Naval investigators swarmed the yards. They blamed unskilled labor, bad welding rods, poor supervision. Orders came down to double-check every seam, to retrain workers to reinforce the hulls. But nothing stopped the failures. Each investigation produced new theories and new confusion. Metallurgists analyzed samples of the steel and found nothing wrong. The alloy met every specification. The welds passed inspection. The numbers all said the ships should have been strong, yet they weren't. Behind the numbers, fear was spreading. In letters, home sailors wrote about the cursed ships. Dock workers whispered that the Liberty hulls were haunted. Some ship captains refused to sail certain vessels. The Maritime Commission began quietly altering design details, adding reinforcing straps, modifying hatch corners, even experimenting with riveted joints again. But the pace of production couldn't slow down. America was fighting on two oceans. The Allies needed ships, not theories. By 1943, the problem had reached crisis level. Two ships had broken apart in harbor conditions. The press began asking questions. Kaiser's miracle was in danger of collapsing under its own ambition. The government called for expert panels, committees, metallurgical reviews. They found nothing conclusive. For all their education and instruments, the experts couldn't see what was happening inside the steel. And in one of Kaiser's shipyards, working the graveyard shift surrounded by sparks and darkness, a single welder was beginning to notice something the engineers never did. Night after night, she watched the metal move, the seams warp, the plates twist slightly under her torch. The others ignored it. She didn't. She didn't have a degree. She didn't need one. She could feel it in her hands. The ships were being built wrong. Long before history remembered her name, Bessie Hamill was just another welder in the sea of overalls and sparks at Richmond Shipyard No. 3. The night shift started at 10:00 p.m. and ended when the horizon began to glow pale gray over San Francisco Bay. The air was thick with smoke, heavy with the scent of molten flux and hot steel. Rows of Liberty ships loomed in the dark, their skeletal frames rising like cathedrals of iron under the floodlights. To most workers, the noise and heat were endless. An industrial symphony played to the rhythm of war. To Bessie, it was alive. She had been there for 8 months, long enough to know the sound of a good weld from a bad one. A clean seam hummed with a steady pitch. A stressed joint rang sharper, higher, like a violin string pulled too tight. At first, she ignored it. The foreman said it didn't matter, that small distortions were part of the process. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The steel plates they welded each night, massive rectangles 20 feet long and an inch thick, were warping in strange patterns. When they cooled, they didn't lie flat. They bowed slightly inward, as though the metal itself was fighting against its own shape. Most welders learn to compensate by brute force, hammer the plates into place, clamp harder, weld faster. Bessie did the opposite. She stopped to watch. Each time she laid a seam, she marked how the steel moved. She began keeping a notebook in her lunch pail, sketching crude diagrams of plates twisting and buckling, the sequence of heat zones, the order her team followed. She saw a pattern forming, one that had nothing to do with luck or bad steel. Every shift followed the same sequence. Welders started at the edges and worked toward the center, or ran long, continuous seams in a straight line from one end of the plate to the other. Each cooling weld contracted, pulling the surrounding metal, tighter, locking tension into the structure. By the time the next seam was added, the stress was already trapped. It was like tightening the center bolts on a wheel before securing the outer ones, a recipe for imbalance and failure. She tried to tell her foreman. He laughed. "The engineers know what they're doing. You just run your torch and keep it straight." When she pressed the issue, he told her to mind her quota, 20 feet of seam per hour. But Bessie couldn't unsee what she'd seen. The steel was talking to her, and she was the only one listening. The more she observed, the more she realized how blind the process had become. Welders were rewarded for speed, not precision. Supervisors timed each section by stopwatch, not by stress distribution. The blueprints handed down from the engineering office dictated where to weld, not when or how. The people designing the ships had never stood under one, never felt the plates vibrate as they cooled. They worked from numbers. She worked from sound heat and instinct. One night in November 1943, after her shift ended, she stayed behind in the yard. The floor was littered with scrap steel cutouts, test pieces, discarded sections. She borrowed a few and welded them together in different sequences, edge to center, center to edge, alternating sides. When they cooled, she measured the curvature with a straight edge. The plates welded from the edges first bent upward like warped wood. The plates welded from the center outward stayed flat. The difference was unmistakable. The next morning, she showed her samples to her foreman. He glanced at them, shrugged, and walked away. "You're a welder, not an engineer," he said. "Don't waste company material." But Bessie wasn't done. She spent her next 2 weekends running her own experiments, marking the temperature drop between passes with chalk, noting how stress built up near corners and openings. She realized the problem wasn't the material, it was the sequence. The engineers had created a system that guaranteed internal tension in every ship they built. Word spread among the night shift. Some thought she was wasting her time. Others quietly agreed. "Those plates are fighting back," one welder said. "I've seen them pop like rifle shots." But no one dared question management. The war effort had no room for doubt. Production was patriotism. Delay was disloyalty. Still, she couldn't let it go. Each time a ship cracked, she saw the faces of the men who had welded it, the thousands of hours spent under fire and smoke, the pride that turned to shame when the newspapers printed headlines about the ships that broke themselves. It wasn't their fault, it was the process. And if she didn't say something, no one would. So she did the unthinkable. In November 1943, she requested a meeting with her supervisors, an official challenge to the engineering department's procedures. It was a violation of the chain of command that could have gotten her fired. When they asked what the meeting was about, she wrote a single line on the form: "Stress from improper welding sequence causing hull failure." The supervisors arrived expecting a complaint. What they got was a demonstration. Bessie laid her test plates on the table, explaining what she'd seen, how heat moved through steel, how the contraction of each seam built up tension that couldn't escape. She showed how a different order, starting in the center and alternating sides, released that stress outward. She didn't use equations or jargon. She used the language of someone who had lived inside the problem. They dismissed her politely. One man called her theory impractical. Another said the distortion came from cheap steel. But one supervisor, an older man named Charles Horton, lingered after the others left. He'd been in shipbuilding long enough to know that sometimes the smallest details made the biggest difference. He asked to see her weld. That night, Horton stood beside her as she worked. He watched how the plate shifted, how she paused between passes to let the metal relax, how the seam cooled evenly instead of curling upward. When the section was finished, it lay flat on the bench. Horton said nothing for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Do that again." It was the beginning of the experiment that would rewrite how America built its ships, and the night a welder's so-called ridiculous idea began to prove every expert wrong. By late November 1943, the rumors had begun to spread quietly across the Richmond yards. Someone on the night shift had challenged the official welding procedure. Supervisors called it a distraction. Engineers dismissed it as shop talk. Yet within days, her name was on everyone's lips. The welder with the ridiculous idea. To the men running Kaiser's empire, the claim sounded absurd. The Liberty ship program had been studied, audited, and inspected by the finest metallurgists and naval architects in the country. Washington had held hearings. Universities had written papers. How could a single woman with a torch claim to see what thousands of engineers had missed? But Charles Horton, the supervisor who had seen Bessie's demonstration, wasn't laughing. He ordered a controlled test. They began in a corner of Yard 3 out of sight from the production lines. Bessie and her small team of welders worked with two identical steel panels, each 12 feet long and 2 inches thick. One would be welded using the standard method edges, first continuous seams, quick passes to meet the quota. The other would follow her sequence, start in the center, alternate sides weld outward in balanced sections, never allowing any one area to overheat. The observers included Horton, 2 metallurgists, and a young engineer with a clipboard full of skepticism. The difference was visible before the welds had even cooled. The first plate twisted upward along its center line, the edges buckling slightly as the heat pulled inward. The second stayed flat, only a faint ripple visible in the reflection of the floodlight. When they measured the distortion, it was less than half of the standard panels. Horton frowned. "Again," he said. They repeated the process with thicker plates, longer seams, more complex joints. Each time the results were the same. Within a week, the metallurgists joined the experiment. They installed strain gauges to measure residual stress, the invisible tension locked into steel as it cooled. When the readings came back, the numbers stunned everyone in the room. Traditional weld sequences left stress concentrations of over 30,000 pounds per square inch near hatch corners and deck edges. Bessie's sequence distributed that stress across broader zones, rarely exceeding 12,000 psi. The difference wasn't theoretical, it was measurable. The young engineer looked at the printout and whispered, "That's impossible." Horton answered, "It's happening anyway." Word reached Henry Kaiser's office before the end of the week. For months he had been fighting political pressure over the Liberty ship failures. The Maritime Commission wanted answers. Congress wanted scapegoats. Now, in a single test bay, an untrained welder had provided both a problem and a solution. Kaiser requested a full briefing. Bessie's samples were brought to the main yard, where a formal demonstration took place under strict supervision. Metallurgists from the University of California examined the plates, measuring stress patterns and micro-fractures under magnification. When they applied pressure tests, the standard welds began to crack along familiar lines, the same fractures that had doomed ships at sea. The ridiculous welds held. That night, Kaiser sat in his office surrounded by reports, production schedules, and cost charts. Stopping the line now would mean halting the miracle of mass production. 90,000 workers, 24-hour shifts, hundreds of subcontractors, all built around speed. Changing the welding sequence meant retraining every welder, rewriting every assembly manual, redesigning every section of every ship. It would slow production when the Navy needed ships most. But the data didn't lie. The Liberty ship failures weren't random. They were systematic. They were built into the process itself. Kaiser didn't hesitate long. He gave the order, "Stop the line, start again, retrain them all." For a man who had built his reputation on speed, it was the most radical decision he could have made. Overnight, his shipyards transformed from assembly lines into classrooms. Experienced welders were pulled from the production floor to become instructors. Each received a new set of diagrams, Bessey's diagrams, showing how to sequence welds from the center outward, alternating sides, never running continuous seams longer than 4 feet without a break. The new method even had a name, now balanced welding sequence. It was, by every industrial measure, an act of madness. Production dropped by 30% in the first week. Critics called it proof that Kaiser's miracle had been a fluke all along. Congressional investigators circled ready to pounce. Newspapers reported training disruptions and schedule delays. Inside the yards, morale wavered, but in the test bays, the results kept coming. Engineers began to understand the physics behind the change. Steel wasn't solid in the way people imagined. It was a crystalline structure, its molecules expanding under heat and contracting as they cooled. When welders ran a continuous line, the hot zone expanded faster than the surrounding cold steel, creating tension that had nowhere to go. Once the weld cooled, that tension remained locked inside an invisible ticking bomb. In warm climates, the steel could absorb it. In cold seas, the crystals lost their flexibility, becoming brittle. A tiny crack at a hatch corner could turn into a chain reaction, traveling the entire length of a hull at nearly the speed of sound. The solution was elegant and simple: let the steel breathe. By welding from the center outward, the metal could release its stress gradually toward the edges. Alternating sides kept heat distribution symmetrical. Short, staggered welds prevented localized buildup. The process didn't require new equipment, new materials, or more manpower, only a new rhythm, one that followed the natural laws of heat and contraction instead of fighting them. By December 1943, the first full-scale hull section welded under the new procedure was completed. When the test team applied stress loads, simulating rough Atlantic seas, the section held perfectly. No distortion, no micro cracks, no audible ping of strain. The engineers were forced to admit it, the ridiculous idea worked. Kaiser's next decision turned it from a local experiment into a revolution. He ordered the redesign of his next generation of ships, the Victory class, to incorporate every lesson from the Liberty ship failures. The new ships would feature rounded hatch corners instead of square ones to eliminate stress concentrations. Their hulls would be built in smaller modular sections to allow precise control of welding sequences. The steel itself would change a refined alloy with slightly less carbon, more manganese, and a trace of nickel to maintain toughness in cold water. It was a sweeping transformation of industrial philosophy, triggered not by a scientist or an admiral, but by a woman who refused to ignore the sound of bending steel. In January 1944, as new welders learned the center-out method on practice plates, the older ones scoffed. They called it superstition, a waste of time. But within weeks, the skeptics began to see the difference. The plates no longer warped. The seams cooled cleanly. The familiar creaks and groans of stressed hulls disappeared. For the first time in months, the shipyard was quiet in a way that felt safe. The first Victory ship built with the new sequence would take shape within weeks. It would not only prove Bessie Hamel's insight, but redefine how every nation on Earth would weld steel for the next century. The ridiculous idea had become the foundation of modern shipbuilding. By February 1944, the Richmond shipyards no longer sounded like chaos. The roar of welding torches and the clanging of steel were still there, but now they followed a rhythm, a new, almost musical sequence of steps and pauses. The yards had become something else entirely, part classroom, part laboratory, part factory. 90,000 workers, welders, fitters, machinists, electricians were learning a new language of steel, one written by a woman who still punched a night shift time card. Henry Kaiser's gamble to halt production had been a public relations disaster at first. Reporters mocked him. Politicians called it industrial suicide. The Navy fretted about lost tonnage when Allied offensives were only months away. But Kaiser didn't flinch. Speed without strength is nothing, he told his supervisors. We're not building coffins, we're building lifelines. In every shed, posters appeared with a new slogan, "Center out, never in." Each welder received a laminated card printed with numbered weld sequences for their assigned sections. Before striking the first arc, they had to trace the sequence with a gloved finger. Instructors like Bessie Hamill, now reluctantly promoted to trainer, walked the rows, watching the timing, checking the heat, ensuring that each plate cooled evenly before the next pass. For every 10 welds, the plate was placed in a stress relief oven, heated to over 2,000 degrees, then allowed to cool slowly overnight. What had once been a frantic assembly race became a choreography of precision. At first, the process seemed painfully slow. Ships that had once been launched in 42 days now took nearly twice that. Schedules fell behind. Supplies stacked up in the rail yards. Skeptics whispered that Kaiser had lost his edge. But then something remarkable happened. The errors vanished. Hull sections that had required rework were now fitting perfectly on the first try. Weld rejection rates dropped from 15% to 3%. Every completed joint passed inspection. When test plates were struck with hammers or chilled in tanks of ice water, they stayed intact. The stress had vanished. The first full Victory-class hull assembled under the new system came together in March 1944. It was a prototype, a test ship not meant for service, but the results were beyond anything expected. The hull showed 0 microcracks under ultrasonic scans. Its structure was so true that the engineers nicknamed it the Straight Ship. Kaiser called it proof of concept. Washington called it luck. Kaiser answered, "Then let's see if luck can be repeated." He ordered Yard 2 to begin preparing for full-scale Victory ship production using the new modular system. Unlike Liberty ships, which had been built upward from a central keel, the Victory ships would be assembled like puzzles. Massive prefabricated blocks, welded separately, then joined in a single synchronized operation. Each block had its own sequence card, its own team, its own timetable. A bow section, for example, consisted of 50 smaller sub-assemblies, bottom plates, bulkheads, deck frames, all welded center outward, balanced, stress-relieved, and precision measured before final joining. Inside the covered prefabrication sheds, the process looked more like an automotive plant than a shipyard. Conveyors rolled sections from one station to the next. Overhead cranes lifted completed modules into massive alignment jigs. Teams rotated through stations in timed intervals, 30 minutes of welding, 10 minutes of rest, 5 minutes of inspection. A central control tower tracked every operation with chalkboards and clocks logging progress in real time. If one section lagged, others adjusted instantly. To the untrained eye, it looked mechanical. To those who understood, it was alive steel breathing in perfect rhythm. On May 12, 1944, Richmond Yard 2 prepared for its most ambitious test yet. 17 prefabricated modules, representing nearly 85% of a completed hull, were aligned and lowered into position. Gantry cranes swung overhead, dropping each block with precision measured in inches. Sparks burst along the seams as hundreds of welders began connecting the modules, each following the same center-out sequence Bessie had pioneered. The operation lasted 11 hours. By dawn, the skeleton of a Victory ship stood complete. For the next 5 days, the yard became a ballet of coordination. Electricians ran cables through pre-drilled conduits. Pipe fitters installed steam lines already measured and tagged. Painters moved behind them, sealing each section as soon as it cooled. The engine, already tested off-site, was lowered directly into place, its mounts aligning perfectly on the first try. Unlike the chaotic Liberty builds of the year before, there were no last-minute corrections, no warped plates, no emergency re-welds. Every measurement fit like a key in a lock. At precisely 5:11 a.m., on June 27, 1944, the hull of the SS Benjamin Warner slid into the water. The crowd that gathered along the pier was silent at first, as if afraid the ship might betray them like the Liberty ships had. But the Warner floated straight and level, her hull lines gleaming under the morning light. When she completed her sea trials 2 days later, without a single stress crack, the silence turned into thunderous applause. 5 days and 11 hours from keel, laying to sea trials. A record not of reckless speed, but of perfection through precision. Kaiser's team called it the 5-day miracle. The press ran headlines declaring shipyards reborn. Washington called off its investigations. The Maritime Commission issued new orders for 500 Victory ships using the same construction model. Even the skeptics in the Navy's Bureau of Ships conceded that Kaiser had achieved something no one had thought possible, combining mass production with structural integrity. But behind the statistics, there was something deeper. The 5-day miracle wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was a transformation of mindset. For the first time, industrial America understood that quality and speed were not enemies. They were partners when built on process, not pressure. The balance sequence proved that discipline could outperform desperation. For Bessie Hamill, it was a strange victory. Her name never appeared in the reports. The documents credited a revised welding methodology developed at Richmond Shipyard. She was still just a shift supervisor, still punching her cards, still welding when needed. But the men who had once laughed now saluted when she walked by. They called her Boss Bess. The ships that followed carried that unseen legacy across 2 oceans. The Victory fleet became the backbone of Allied logistics, carrying tanks to Normandy, fuel to Okinawa, and food to liberated Europe. Not one of them ever broke in half. Not one failed from brittle fracture. The design was so sound that many Victory ships would continue sailing for decades after the war, long after Liberty ships had rusted into memory. In the Richmond yards, someone painted a new phrase on the wall above the main gate. It wasn't a slogan. It was a truth carved into the soul of the workers who had seen the transformation firsthand. We slowed down to win. The 5-day miracle wasn't the triumph of speed, it was the redemption of patience. A nation obsessed with production had learned through a welder's ridiculous idea that true progress begins the moment you stop to listen to the sound of the steel. When the first Victory ships began crossing the Atlantic in late 1944, they carried more than cargo. They carried proof that the invisible science of stress, heat, and human observation could change the course of a war. The same forces that had destroyed the Liberty ships were still there: temperature, tension, fatigue. But this time, they were understood, controlled, and harnessed. For the first time, engineers could explain in numbers and in physics why the new ships held together where others had failed. The breakthrough began with the steel itself. The Liberty ships had been made from a standard carbon manganese alloy that performed well in mild climates, but failed catastrophically in cold seas. Below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the steel's internal structure changed. What had once been ductile and flexible became brittle, its crystal lattice tightening until it behaved less like metal and more like glass. A tiny flaw, perhaps no wider than a human hair, could trigger a fracture that raced through hundreds of feet of welded plate. To solve this, Kaiser's metallurgists designed a new alloy known as killed steel. The name was as brutal as the process. During smelting, aluminum was added to remove dissolved oxygen from the molten metal, killing its reactivity and preventing tiny gas bubbles that weakened the structure. Manganese levels were adjusted, and a trace of nickel, barely 0.25%, was added to increase low-temperature toughness. It was an expensive addition, but its effect was transformative. Tests at the University of California laboratories showed that the transition temperature, the point where the steel changed from ductile to brittle, had dropped from roughly 40 degree Fahrenheit in the Liberty ship's alloy to just 5 degree Fahrenheit. That 35-degree difference meant survival in the freezing North Atlantic, where seawater hovered just above the freezing point. In those conditions, Liberty steel shattered like porcelain. Victory steel flexed, absorbed the shock, and held firm. But metallurgy was only one half of the story. The other half was geometry, the way stress moved through the ship's body. The Liberty design had used square hatch openings and hard angled bulkhead connections because they were easy to cut and assemble. Unfortunately, those right angles became amplifiers of stress. When a wave bent the hull even slightly, the force at those corners multiplied 3 or 4 times the normal load. Combined with the residual stress from welding, they became ticking fracture points. The Victory redesign replaced every sharp corner with smooth curves. Rounded hatches distributed stress, evenly reducing the multiplier from 4 to less than 2. It seemed like a cosmetic change, an aesthetic flourish, but the numbers proved otherwise. A Liberty ship hitting a 40-foot wave might see local stress spikes exceeding 60,000 psi near a square hatch far beyond the steel's limit. The same wave hitting a Victory ship generated only 25,000 psi comfortably within safe range. Another unseen improvement lay in the ship's seams themselves. The Liberty ships had been fully welded from bow to stern, a single continuous structure. The design saved time, but created an unintended vulnerability. When a crack started, there was nothing to stop it. It could run the entire length of the hull uninterrupted. The Victory ships introduced a radical concept: deliberate imperfection. At strategic points, riveted joints replaced welded seams, creating mechanical crack arresters. These joints acted like fire breaks in a forest. If a fracture began, it lost energy when it hit a riveted seam, stopping the propagation before it became catastrophic. The engineers called it defensive design, the idea that strength wasn't about perfection, but about forgiving failure. No structure is flawless forever, they argued. The key is ensuring that when it fails safely. Internally, the Victory ships were built like layered armor. Frames were doubled at critical stress zones. Bulkheads were spaced to align with the new welding sequence, so the natural expansion and contraction of steel followed predictable paths. Even the deck plate thicknesses were recalculated not to add brute strength, but to balance how stress traveled across the surface. The result was harmony between material method and motion. When the first stress tests were conducted at the Naval Materials Laboratory in 1944, the findings were staggering. Liberty-class test sections began cracking at stress levels around $32,000 psi. Victory-class sections endured up to $54,000 before showing microfractures, and even then those cracks stopped within inches, rather than running uncontrolled. At sea, those numbers translated into survival. Between June 1944 and the war's end in August 1945, 531 Victory ships entered service. Not one suffered a catastrophic hull failure. The Navy logged only minor surface cracks in a handful of vessels, each caught during routine inspections and repaired before spreading. The same period saw dozens of Liberty ships retired or lost to structural failure. The contrast was undeniable. The data didn't just vindicate Henry Kaiser's decision, it proved that Bessie Hamel's intuition had been right from the start. The issue had never been bad steel or sloppy labor. It was the silent physics of heat and contraction, multiplied by geometry and ignorance. The solution wasn't more force or faster work. It was balance and understanding that the steel itself needed time to breathe. As the war pushed deeper into the Pacific, the Victory ships became the backbone of Allied logistics. They sailed through Arctic convoys to Murmansk, endured typhoons in the South China Sea, and delivered supplies to Normandy under enemy fire. Their hulls flexed, shuddered, and groaned, but they did not break. Sailors who had once slept in fear now slept in confidence, knowing that their ship would hold. Engineers began referring to them as forgiving ships, vessels designed not just to perform, but to endure human error, storm, and time. And long after the war ended, their legacy would echo across industries far beyond the ocean. The same welding sequences were adopted for bridge construction, oil pipelines, and even the emerging field of nuclear power. The principle was universal control, the sequence control, the stress. Every skyscraper beam, every offshore platform, every pressure vessel built in the decades to come carried a piece of that discovery. By the time Victory ship number 500 launched in 1945, the mystery that had haunted shipbuilders for years was finally solved. The Liberty ships had cracked because their creators believed that strength came from rigidity. The Victory ships endured because their makers learned that strength comes from flexibility. Steel is alive. It moves, expands, contracts, resists, and remembers. And once you understand how it breathes, you can build anything to last. When the war ended in 1945, the shipyards fell silent for the first time in years. The great cranes stood motionless against the California sky, their hooks swaying in the wind over dry docks that no longer echoed with hammer strikes or welding torches. The Richmond yards had produced more than 700 ships during the war, a miracle of steel and sweat that helped turn the tide of history. But now, as peace returned, the people who had built that miracle drifted back to their lives unnoticed, uncelebrated, and mostly forgotten. Among them was Bessie Hamill. She clocked out one last time in the summer of 1946. There was no ceremony, no photograph, no newspaper clipping. Her final paycheck was folded neatly inside a brown envelope. She walked home through the quiet streets of the company town she had helped build and hung her gloves by the door. The war was over. Her work, as far as anyone knew, was done. For a while, even the engineers who had studied her method seemed to move on. The Victory ship program wound down, the yards closed, and the world turned its attention to new technologies, jet engines, atomic power, the dawn of the computer age. The Liberty ships that had survived were scrapped or sold to private companies. The Victory ships kept sailing quietly, doing their job. They carried grain to Europe under the Marshall Plan troops, to Korea, and supplies during the Cold War. Decades later, when the last of them was finally retired, inspectors noted something astonishing. After millions of miles and decades of service, their hulls still showed no catastrophic cracks. Bessie never knew it, but the method she had discovered had already outlived the war. In 1947, the American Welding Society published a new standard, the Structural Welding Code, a document that codified the best practices of the wartime shipyards. Buried deep within its technical language was a section describing the balanced welding sequence, complete with diagrams that mirrored the ones Bessie had drawn by hand 3 years earlier. It became mandatory for all critical structural welds in shipbuilding bridges and pressure vessels. The code did not name her. It never would. But her influence was everywhere. When engineers designed the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the 1970s, 800 miles of welded steel carrying hot oil through sub-zero tundra, they relied on stress relief procedures born in the Richmond yards. When the Golden Gate Bridge underwent its seismic retrofit in the 1990s, the welding teams followed computer simulations based on the same center-outward principles. Even in the construction of nuclear reactors, where steel pressure vessels must endure both extreme heat and radiation, engineers used stress relief ovens nearly identical in concept to the ones Kaiser installed during the Victory program. Each of these modern marvels carried within it the ghost of a welder who refused to accept that's how it's done. In the decades after the war, historians wrote volumes about Henry Kaiser and his Industrial Revolution. They called him the father of mass production at sea. They wrote about his workers, his shipyards, his innovations. But Bessie Hamill's name rarely appeared. She lived quietly in Sacramento, working odd jobs, raising 2 children, never mentioning that she had once changed the way the world built its ships. When she died in 1987, her obituary was 3 sentences long. It mentioned that she had worked in wartime shipyards and enjoyed gardening. There was no hint that the welding code followed by every modern engineer carried her fingerprints. And yet her legacy endures in ways more lasting than any medal or monument. Every welder who lays a bead on a skyscraper column and follows the rule of center out alternate sides is speaking her language. Every inspector who measures residual stress with an ultrasonic gauge is verifying her discovery. Every engineer who designs for flexibility instead of rigidity is walking the path she revealed. The story of the ridiculous welder is more than a tale of technical innovation. It's a reminder that progress doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it comes from the hum of a night shift, the patience to listen, and the courage to say, "This isn't right." Bessie Hamill didn't invent welding metallurgy or engineering theory. What she gave the world was something simpler and rarer. She taught it how to listen. The same humility that defined her work defined the philosophy that grew from it. Modern engineering has a word for it now: feedback. The idea that the process itself can teach the designer that the hand holding the torch knows something the blueprint never will. From Toyota's lean production to NASA's fault-tolerant systems, the concept runs deep. Respect the worker, observe the process, and let reality correct theory. Those are the seeds planted by one woman's ridiculous question in a wartime shipyard. Today, a handful of preserved Victory ships still float in harbors around the world museums of steel and memory. Visitors walk their decks, read plaques about wartime production, and marvel at how these vessels survived where others failed. Most never notice the weld seams running along the hulls, smooth, evenly spaced, unbroken. But for anyone who listens closely, they whisper her story in the faint metallic echoes of the sea. We were built by someone who cared enough to ask why. If you believe ordinary people can change the course of history, comment 1. If you think great ideas only belong to engineers and leaders, hit like. But remember, every bridge you cross, every tower that stands, and every ship that sails owes a silent debt to a woman who refused to stop listening. And if you want to hear more untold stories of courage, genius, and stubborn hope from the forgotten corners of World War II, subscribe now. Because somewhere in every machine that moves and every structure that endures, there is another ridiculous idea waiting to be heard.